Ken graduated magna cum laude from John Jay College of Criminal Justice, earned his law degree from NYU Law School, and won, in the process of that, the prestigious Arthur T. Vanderbilt Medal for outstanding contributions to the law school community. As a federal prosecutor in the Eastern District of New York, he was on the team that successfully prosecuted Officer Justin Volpe for the 1997 beating and torture of Abner Louima. He also served as a special assistant to the U.S. Treasury Department under Secretary for Enforcement in the General Counsel's office at Treasury, and he was on the team President Clinton appointed to investigate that 1993 raid on the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas. Now, moving to private practice, Thompson worked at a prominent international law firm, then co-founded his own firm, where he represented victims of employment discrimination, including those who'd been subjected to unlawful prejudice due to their race, gender, age, religion, or sexual orientation. D.A. Thompson also worked with members of Congress and the clergy to convince the U.S. Department of Justice to reinvestigate the 1955 murder of 14-year-old Emmett Till in Mississippi. You may recall that Emmett Till's brutal death by torture had helped spark the civil rights movement, inspiring Rosa Parks, in part, to take her stand on December 1st, 1955, during the Montgomery bus boycott. I am very honored, very pleased to present to you the District Attorney of Brooklyn, a rising young star in the political firmament, Ken Thompson.
I want to thank you, Betsy, for that generous introduction. I want to just say that I am grateful to have received this invitation just to come speak with you, such an illustrious and respected group of journalists, because your organization knows, because the founder, the first president, helped found NAACP, that it's important to correct injustices throughout our society, including injustices within our miscarriages of justices within our criminal justice system. And so I am delighted to be here before the Society of Silurians just to talk with you briefly about what I'm doing as the Brooklyn DA to prevent crime, to prosecute criminals, to improve law enforcement's relationship with the community, and to restore confidence in our criminal justice system. But I think before I go any further, that it's important for me just to share with you very briefly a little bit about my background. Betsy alluded to it. I am standing here as the Brooklyn DA because of my mother, Clara Thompson. And I'm going to get to my mother in a minute, but I want to just let you know that I started out life in the New York City public housing developments. I was raised by a single mother who taught me to dream big, but that without hard work I would not accomplish much. And my mother did something I think that was extraordinary way back in 1973. She became a New York City police officer when there were no women patrolling on the streets of New York City. And she did so as a black woman raising 3 young children alone in the projects. And so my mother became not only a police officer, she's one of the first women to go on patrol, black or white, in the history of the city back in 1973. And she served 21 years on the job. And as a little boy, I remember seeing my mother get dressed in her uniform every morning at our home. And she would head off to work. I didn't know at the time that the reason why she had to put on her uniform in our apartment and walk out with it on and come back with it on and let the world know while we were living in the projects that she was a police officer was because back then they didn't have adequate facilities for women to even change into their uniforms when they got to the station house. So my mother was truly a pioneer. But what she did for me is she instilled within me principles of fairness and of justice that I hold dear to this very day. Little did my mother know that that her youngest son, who she had fought to give a better life, would one day graduate from John Jay College with honors, attend NYU Law School, serve as a federal prosecutor in the Department of Justice, and become Brooklyn's chief law enforcement officer. All because she had the vision and the courage way back in the 70s to become a police officer against all the odds that she faced. And so as I follow in my mother's footsteps, I am determined to make sure that there's equal justice for all, irrespective of race, irrespective of how much money you have or don't have, or where you live, or where you come from. So as Brooklyn's chief law enforcement officer, my primary duty is to protect public safety. Now, one of the major issues that threatens public safety is the issue of gun violence, which is occurring all too often, not only in Brooklyn, but throughout our country. Now, let's just consider the statistics. 11,000 Americans are murdered with guns throughout our country each year, and 21,000 more die by accident or by suicide from guns. And so we talk about mass shootings. You're a journalist. What drives our conversation nationally about gun violence has been mass shootings, and I understand that. Mass shootings are horrific in nature, but the truth of the matter is they only account for only 1% of the gun homicides in our country. What fuels our staggering gun homicide rate is actually urban gun violence. It's a fact that young black men are shooting and killing each other and dying from gun violence on the streets of our cities day after day, from Brooklyn to Chicago, from Chicago to New Orleans, and no one seems to care. So what we all know in this room is that there is a deadly conduit. We call it an iron pipeline that runs from the South to New York, from states that have weak gun laws, like Georgia. And the guns from those states are flooding into our city, into the hands of these young men, walking the streets of Brooklyn, walking the streets of Manhattan. And so what we're doing in Brooklyn is we're dealing with the iron pipeline. We're dealing with this flood of guns coming into our city. And the way that we're dealing with it is we're working very closely with our partners in the NYPD. And what we've been able to do in a little over 2 years of my tenure, we've been able to take out 3 very dangerous out-of-state gun smuggling rings and prevented 550 guns, many of them assault weapons, from hitting the streets of Brooklyn by taking down doing some other raids in Brooklyn as well. Now, what am I talking about? As we sit here today, I'm confident that there's somebody driving up I-95, the Iron Pipeline, with guns in their cars that are destined for our city here. We have been able to take out these out-of-state gun traffickers who bring up guns in cars, who bring up guns on these cheap Chinatown buses that travel between New York and D.C. and Atlanta and Boston and Philadelphia. We've even been able to take out one of these smuggling rings that was actually bringing these guns on Delta airline flights. And you know what? The amazing thing about that, when we learned about that particular gun smuggling ring, the feds didn't even know about it. It took my prosecutors in the Brooklyn DA's office to tell the FBI, to tell the U.S. Attorney's Office down in Georgia, and to tell the Department of Homeland Security that we have a problem. And it's a problem, I think, that's in other parts of the country, at other airports, where our pilots, our flight attendants, and all of us have to go through TSA checkpoints in order to catch our flight. But down in Atlanta, if you're a baggage handler or a ramp worker, you don't have to go through such checks. All you have to do is park your car in the employee parking lot and badge into the terminal. And so we broke up that ring because it was not only a threat to the people of New York City, in particular the people of Brooklyn, but it really exposed a glaring hole in our national and airport security. So there's rarely a week that goes by in Brooklyn or anywhere else in the country where there's not another act of senseless gun violence playing out. Now, when folks focus their attention on mass shootings, the definition of a mass shooting, I think, should be redefined, because we had 5 young people in Red Hook in August standing outside on a summer night, and a car full of guys pulled up, and these guys got out and they just started shooting at these 5 young people. They shot them all, including a young woman who was 7 months pregnant. She lost her baby. We made an arrest. We're going to prosecute those young men. That didn't happen down in Texas. That happened right in the Red Hook section of Brooklyn. And then in November, a beautiful little boy, and I know many of you know about this incident, named Tayshawn Lee, was playing on the swing like many 9-year-olds do. I have a 9-year-old son. And he was lured off that swing into an alley by a gang in Chicago. And that young 9-year-old boy was shot 5 times in his face and in his neck, executed in retaliation for something that they said his brother did. So we're not just dealing with a local crisis when it comes to gun violence. It's really a national crisis. And if you look at the numbers that are coming out of Chicago, last year, over 2,000 people were shot in Chicago. And would you believe, as of today, 578 people have been shot in Chicago. And it is only March 16th. Brooklyn, sadly, last year we had 575 people shot. And so the problem that we face in law enforcement is we have these states down south that make it too easy for anyone to get a gun. And this is not about the Second Amendment. It's about criminals getting these guns and killing our children and our police officers. You have strong states with strong gun laws like New York. We have some of the strongest in the nation. You have a state like Illinois. They have strong gun laws. But when you have weak states, states with weak gun laws like Georgia and Virginia and South Carolina and Indiana, those states overwhelmed our efforts here in New York and other places to stop the bloodshed. And so that's why I have been going back and forth to Capitol Hill over the last couple of months to talk about this gun epidemic. And this is a message I'm bringing to you and I bring to the people of Brooklyn, that we need tougher national gun laws. We not only need federal intervention, we need Congress to do the right thing. It may not happen in our lifetime, but we should demand that they do the right thing. And what we also have to do is we have to go after those who are responsible for the gun violence in a more aggressive way. And the truth is, most of the people who are responsible for the gun violence and the shootings here in the city and across the country are members of gangs. We must go after many of these gang members. Now, this board here reflects shootings that occurred in Brooklyn last year. I don't know how many of you live in Brooklyn. If you do, please come up and look at the map. The blue pins represent shootings. The red pins represent homicides by gunfire. Now, I live in the Clinton Hills section of Brooklyn with my wife and 2 young children. And yet, you'll see, I've had shootings in my own neighborhood. You look at Coney Island. Most people think of the amusement park there. But there's a western section of Coney Island where the public housing is. Look how many shootings have occurred there last year. If I put up the map from 2014, it looked relatively the same. But there's hope with respect to this map. Look at Bay Ridge, right here. If any of you live in Brooklyn, I hope you live in Bay Ridge. Not one reported shooting to the whole NYPD in 2015 and in 2014. And so what I'm determined to do as a Brooklyn DA is to make more Brooklyn look like Bay Ridge with respect to shootings. The NYPD divides Brooklyn in half. There's a Brooklyn North and a Brooklyn South. Most of the shootings occur in Brooklyn North. And they're being done by these young guys in gangs, many of them. And so what we have started to do is we have started to go after these gangs in a real aggressive way because they're drivers of these shootings, they're drivers of crime. And I tell people in Brooklyn, no matter where I go, that we have to be concerned about these shootings. We have to be concerned about these gangs because these guns are no longer just staying in certain communities. These guns are on the move. These guys are on the move. A couple of months ago, we announced the indictment of 18 members of a gang called the Folk Nation. It's really an alliance of gangs. It's not really a gang itself. Think about baseball. There's a National League and an American League. There are a bunch of teams that make up the National League and a bunch of teams that make up the American League. Well, Folk Nation is like that. Folk Nation is a really group of many gangs. It started in the prison system in Chicago, and it's made its way here to New York. So we indicted 18 members of the Folk Nation gang that was based in Flatbush, Brooklyn. Now, what's amazing about these guys, and I'll say allegedly, because we haven't convicted them yet, but we've charged them with taking murderous joyrides, with having a bloody battle with rival Crip gang members, and going out on what they called hunting expeditions. So they would get in cars, and they would drive through Brooklyn and shoot at each other. And they didn't care who was caught up in the middle. And so there was a 60-year-old woman who was coming out of a grocery store, shopping. She just shopped. She was with her sister. She got caught up in one of those shootouts, and now she's paralyzed. There was a 50-year-old man who was sitting in the courtyard of his building on Coney Island Avenue talking to his son. Beautiful summer day, and we have this on videotape from the video surveillance. And this gang came right into that courtyard with all the children playing and riding around on their little scooters and shot that man right in his heart. 50-year-old man who had nothing to do with gangs. And then they heard that there was a video shoot in Dumbo at Gleason's gym, the boxing gym there. So these guys got in cars and went all the way to Dumbo and waited for their rivals to come outside. And when they did, in broad daylight, there was a gunfight in Dumbo. These young men were shot. They jumped in their cars and they drove through Borum Hill. They drove through Park Slope. They ditched their bullet-riddled car and their guns right near Prospect Park. And so I say this because we cannot tolerate this. This is not something that we should ignore and say that's in a certain neighborhood, because it is coming into all neighborhoods. So what am I doing about this in particular? I intend to make a difference with respect to this map. And so I created with respect to gun violence. So I created a new unit in the DA's office called the Crime Strategies Unit. And it essentially focuses on these drivers of crime. Whenever any of these guys get arrested for any offense, and they come into the criminal justice system all the time, maybe not for a shooting, but for riding in a stolen car, subway evasion, whatever you want to call it, we get an alert that this person is in the system. And so my prosecutors and crime strategies, they serve sort of like a intelligence arm of the office. They spring into action, and they arm the prosecutors in arraignment to make the strongest argument, to charge these guys with felonies if we can, to keep them off the streets. The Manhattan DA's office has had a crime strategies unit for over 5 years. And when you hear about shootings in the city, just think about where you often hear that they occur. They occur in Brooklyn, and they occur in the Bronx. They do happen in Manhattan. No place is safe. But the crime strategies unit in the Manhattan DA's office has done wonders in terms of driving it down. And I believe that our crime strategies unit, which is just getting off the ground, is going to have similar results. But I also did something else. I created a new unit called Violent Criminal Enterprise. It's called the Violent Criminal Enterprise Bureau. We call it VCE. When I was a federal prosecutor in Brooklyn, I worked in VCE. And what that unit essentially is, I combined my gang unit and my major narcotics unit, because when I became DA, we had these two units. They had about 30 prosecutors in each, and they weren't really communicating with each other. Sometimes they were looking at some of the same groups. So I thought that we needed to streamline our operations so we can keep the people safe. And so far, VCE has been able to identify these gun runners. Now, there's a distinction with us in Brooklyn. All DAs in the city, when we hear that somebody is selling a gun, we go after that person. We introduce an undercover officer to buy some guns, and then we take that case down. There's a difference in Brooklyn because I think it's important to get to the source of the guns. And so, because when we grab this young guy off the corner for selling a gun, that's important. But there's likely going to be another young guy standing there in his place. And so what we do is we go up on wiretaps. I say it publicly, these guys are not listening to me. We listen to them, though. We listen to their phone calls because we want to find out where these guns are coming from. So far, all roads have led us down to Atlanta. So I want you to know that gun violence is something that I'm determined to do something about as the Brooklyn DA. Until we get the federal government to act, I'm going to continue to do these long-term investigations. And now we're indicting these folks down in Georgia, extradited them to New York City and putting them on Rikers Island. We did the first big case against this family down there. The leader was this guy, Michael Quick. Michael Quick just pled guilty to an 18-year prison term in Brooklyn because the evidence we amassed against him was overwhelming. So in my little over 2 years in office, we have handled more than 200,000 cases. Murderers, rapists, heroin dealers, drug traffickers, and scam artists. Whether the weapon is a gun or a scheme to defraud undocumented immigrants, my office and its more than 1,000 employees, including 500 prosecutors, work hard every day to keep the people of Brooklyn safe. When you think of DA's offices, you may think that Brooklyn is a typical DA's office. It is not. We're the largest DA's office in the city and the third largest DA's office in the country. Los Angeles is number 1, Chicago's number 2, Brooklyn is number 3. And so one of the things Betsy alluded to that I want to touch on, it goes to the issue of fairness. And what I mean by that is, when I took office, there was an issue with respect to wrongful convictions. The New York Times did a superb series of articles on what was happening in the Brooklyn DA's office with respect to Wrongful Convictions, it focused mostly on this one detective, retired detective Louis Scarcella. So when I became DA in January 2014, like I said, I inherited an office that has over 500 prosecutors. You know how many were working on these wrongful conviction cases? 2. Now I have 10 floors at 350J. Those 2 ADAs weren't even sitting next to each other. And they weren't really given resources to conduct these investigations. And so I thought that was crazy. And so I committed to build a real unit. The one I inherited was called the Conviction Integrity Unit. But I didn't think it had much integrity. So I renamed it the Conviction Review Unit. And I was able to convince a very prominent law professor at Harvard Law School, his name is Ron Sullivan, to come down to Brooklyn every week and to serve as my special counsel to help me build the unit and help me conduct these investigations. And so there were about 100 murder cases that we had to look at the time. Now I have a unit roughly of 10 full-time prosecutors. It costs about $1.1 million a year to run. I went back and forth to the city council and to the mayor and asked for the money. Now, why is this all important? It's all important because of what's reflected on this board. What you see on this board, you see 19 people staring out at you. They all reflect miscarriages of justice done to them. They all reflect lives that have been ruined. I believe that as Brooklyn DA, I should do something about this and not turn a blind eye. And so we have a real conviction review unit that is determined to get to the truth. And I assure each and every one of you that I'm not interested in releasing murderers back into the community. But these cases, the evidence was not even close in many of them. We just exonerated the first woman 2 weeks ago, Vanessa Gathers. Vanessa Gathers is a beautiful woman. She's in her late 50s now. There was an elderly gentleman who was beaten in his home, and he went into a coma, and he died some months later. Before he died, he said that it was some women who came into his home. Detective Scarcella was assigned to the case. He approached Ms. Gathers shortly after the victim died, and she denied having anything to do with it. 5 years later, Detective Scarcella went back to Ms. Gathers, and she gave a confession, but her confession lacked a narrative. You would think that someone who participated in a horrific robbery that led to the death of someone would be able to describe to you what happened and would not have to be prompted every step of the way, or would not mix up the time that the robbery occurred, or would not botch the fact that they say the victim was in a wheelchair when he was being beaten, when the victim never had a wheelchair. Basic information. Ms. Gathers was convicted. She spent 10 years in prison. We vacated her conviction in the interest of justice because we concluded that her confession was false. Jonathan Fleming is on that board as well. He spent almost 25 years in prison. He maintained that he didn't commit the murder he was charged with. He said he was in Disney World with his kids in Florida. The murder occurred in Williamsburg, in a housing project there. So Jonathan Fleming asserted an alibi defense. If he wasn't there, he couldn't have been involved in the murder. The office back then fought him tooth and nail and convicted him. He wrote me a letter, and so did his lawyers, asking me to look at his case. My conviction review unit investigated the case fairly and thoroughly. And they came to me during that investigation, and they said that there was something in the file. It was a receipt that was seized from Mr. Fleming the night he was arrested by the police out of his wallet. It was a receipt that showed he had paid a hotel bill down in Disney World a few hours before the murder here in Brooklyn. That receipt was never given to his defense attorney. So the jury that convicted Jonathan Fleming never saw that critical piece of evidence. And so we moved in the interest of justice to free Jonathan Fleming from his 25 years of imprisonment. I believe that DAs should lead this movement, not be dragged kicking and screaming down the road because of the enormous power and discretion we have in the criminal justice system. And so I actually held a 2-day wrongful conviction summit in Brooklyn a few months ago. And I invited DAs from all over the country and other members of criminal justice organizations, and they came from Texas, Washington State, Louisiana. For 2 days, many of them had never stepped foot in Brooklyn. And I told them, I said, we need to deal with these cases. It doesn't make us soft on crime. And I said, I know why many of us are afraid to do it. We're afraid that we won't get reelected. We're not profiles in courage. But we occupy leadership positions in the criminal justice system. And so I intend to lead this movement from Brooklyn because I think the people of Brooklyn want me to do the right thing here. And guess what? This is what I tell folks who are like, oh, this is just some social science project or social justice gone awry. When these folks were wrongfully convicted and in prison, those who are truly guilty remain free to continue to terrorize us and put our lives in danger. The last thing I want to talk about is the issue of all of these warrants, these open warrants in New York City. Do you know that there are over 1 million open warrants for people who committed minor, low-level offenses like riding your bike on the sidewalk, walking your dog without a leash, littering? Now, I know you find folks have never done anything like that, but I can tell you that we have a broken criminal justice system. We have a broken summons court system. And so folks in Brooklyn who get tickets for committing these low-level offenses, they get a return date that's almost 4 months away. And the vast majority of them have to travel all the way to Manhattan, to 346 Broadway, to get that ticket adjudicated. And guess what? If they don't show up for any reason, a bench warrant is issued. So if you can't take off from work because you'll lose your job, bench warrant. Your child is sick at home and you can't get to court, bench warrant. God forbid somebody died in your family the night before and you can't get to court, bench warrant. I went to 346 Broadway as the DA because I've heard so much about it, to see it myself. And I was astonished at what we have planned out right here in New York City. You see, I believe that a bench warrant should be issued for someone who refuses to come to court, not someone who can't come to court. And so that person, and we have so many people who have bench warrants and they don't even know it because they got tickets years ago that they didn't deal with. So the next time that person is stopped and their name is run, that warrant is going to pop up and that police officer has absolutely no discretion. They must put that person in handcuffs and bring them to central booking, where they may be put in a cell with a rapist or someone who has committed a shooting. I think that we deserve better. I think that everyday New Yorkers should not be subjected to that. I believe that our police officers should not be put in unnecessary peril when they approach someone who knows they have a warrant who may resist or flee. And so I created a program to deal with it in Brooklyn. It's called Begin Again. It's a simple program. I bring the entire court system. I bring state Supreme Court judges. I bring legal aid attorneys. I bring my prosecutors. I bring court officers, and I show up. And what we do is we typically set up shop on a Saturday, and we're going to move it around at a church. And so we transform a church into a house of justice. And I don't limit it to people who live in Brooklyn. It's open to anyone in New York City. And guess what? Thousands of people have shown up to our Begin Again events. Thousands, over 2,000 people seeking relief. And what we do is we vacate those warrants and we help them deal with those old summonses. That's why I named it Begin Again, because I believe that if they come halfway, we should meet them halfway, because we have a broken summons court system that contributed partly to this problem. And when they leave, I want them to move on with their lives, and I hope they go back to their communities and tell them that the DA came into the community with the court system, and he helped us. That's why I stand there all day and I shake the hands of everyone who show up. I walk that line, and they're shocked to see the DA, because I'm not the one with the warrant. But I thank them for coming out. I'm going to do my part as the Brooklyn DA to keep the people of Brooklyn safe, but we have to be honest that our criminal justice system is in dire need of repair. And so as my mother walked the beat for 21 years, I hope to do her proud as the DA, and I hope to implement initiatives in Brooklyn that will keep the people of Brooklyn safe, but also make our criminal justice system better. That's the charge I have. That's how she raised me, and that's what I intend to do. Thank you so much. I'll answer any questions.
Thank you, thank you. We have time for some questions, and I know you have some. I'm going to ask the first one.
Yes.
I'm just curious, we're all concerned about what's going on with Apple and with all of the cell phones. I'm sure you have a cell phone. I have a cell phone. I wouldn't be surprised if you told me where you stood on this, but how serious a case is this? You're out on the ground. Your people all the time are trying to get the information. You said we're listening to them. Or are you not able to listen to them? What's the story?
Well, let me just say this. We are listening to them. We go up on wiretaps. But we've had a couple of phones that we have not been able to get into. And my colleague, Cy Vance, has led the charge on this, and he's doing a phenomenal job with FBI Director Comey. I think that we have to keep people safe. And so as the DA in Brooklyn, it has affected us where we have not been able to get into a phone or two, that we wanted to find out what was going on to get more evidence. So the situation in San Bernardino, I think, is more critical because we don't know if there are other terrorists who are involved in that terrorist act. And so I support Cy Vance. I think this is the right thing to do. I understand there's privacy issues, but law enforcement should not be handcuffed in its ability to keep people safe.
Mr. Thompson, how good or bad a job do you think the news media is doing in illuminating the roots of the gun problem, and what stories should they be writing and are not writing?
Let me say this. I think the biggest problem we have, it's a trap. We fall into the Second Amendment argument, and we should never fall into that. I believe that people should be able to lawfully have guns. The issue is really about criminals getting these guns. And I think that everyone knows about this iron pipeline, but the ease with which these criminals can get these guns. Let me just give you a little bit more details on this Delta flight. And I love Delta. It could have been another airline. That just happened to be the one that they took. How is it that these guys down there, and this is what we charged them with, brought all of these guns on the internet, or off the internet, down in Georgia, without any background checks? One of the current Delta airline employees we charged brought the guns into the terminal because he didn't have to go through any checkpoint. He just badged into the terminal and he was in with all of us. And then met his co-conspirators in the restroom and gave them all of these guns, including assault weapons, loaded, to get on planes. And we allege that they did this almost 20 times. Trips from Atlanta to JFK, where they brought 150 guns to New York City this way. I think that that's something that we should look at and say, wait, these merchants of death are not only bringing these guns up in cars and on buses, but now when we sit next to someone who has a backpack, we don't even know if they have guns in it after what happened on 9/11. I think that too much of the media focuses on NRA arguments and Second Amendment when it's not about the Second Amendment. It really isn't. We see what's playing out in Brooklyn with these young folks. These young people in Brooklyn, they don't have the ability to get these guns. These guns are being brought to them. These guns are not made in New York State for the most part. So I think that what we should do is we should collectively put more attention on the carnage. We shouldn't have to wait for another mass shooting. We're having mass shootings every day. I think 2 people being shot is a mass shooting. And so I know people get tired of hearing this, but when do we have to pay attention? When bullets start whizzing by us? The example of Folk Nation is a great example. I went before the Brooklyn Heights Association about a month ago. I brought the video, I didn't bring it here, of that 50-year-old man being shot in his heart. And I said, you may not feel that that has anything to do with you because that was way on Coney Island Avenue. And here we are in the heart of Brooklyn Heights. But I said, the young men who did that to that innocent man, they came right through your neighborhood on the way to Dumbo to engage in that shootout. And then they drove right back through your neighborhood and dumping their guns out of their car. I think that we should do more to pay attention to the gun violence in our community. That little boy who was murdered in Chicago, 9-year-old boy, I don't understand why the city didn't shut down then. I mean, it's all connected. It really is.
Mr. Thompson, during the next 8 or 9 months, I think we're going to have a lot of tension across the country as the presidential campaign proceeds. And I wondered if you could enlighten us about what DAs will be thinking about in the case of big assemblages in public where hate speech and the First Amendment will be conflicting with one another.
Well, I mean, look what happened in Chicago Friday night. I think that, I don't think it's really for DAs to sort of like swoop in and check folks. I think that the presidential candidates should set the tone. I don't think that we should say, okay, the presidential candidates can say, I feel like punching that guy in the face. Or I'm going to pay this guy's legal fees who did punch someone in the face, and then turn around and say the DA should figure this all out. Obviously, we have a role to play, but for us to now have to get into and sort of manage political rallies is not what this country should be about. That's just my take. I will deal with it when there's a rally in Brooklyn. Right now, I'm watching it like all of you. Yes, Tony.
How are you, Mr. Thompson? I was wondering, I have a serious question, but since that last one, I was wondering if you could possibly find grounds to arrest Donald Trump and put him in jail. This board is traceable, as you pointed out, to what I guess we can call a dirty cop, detective, who coerced witnesses and, in the example you gave, withheld a receipt. So he withheld evidence, he coerced witnesses, and many people were convicted, and you are now picking up the pieces, your office. DAs inherently have a very sensitive relationship with the police. So what I'm wondering is, the detective in this case couldn't have pulled this off all on his own. Prosecutors back then were either incompetent or looking the other way. How much do we have to worry about that relationship between police and district attorneys, which is symbiotic, but it's also conflicting, and in terms of belief in the criminal justice system?
Tony, that's a good question. Let me just make it clear, because I apologize, I did not make it clear earlier. The 19 cases that are reflected on this board, the 19 people, they were not all Detective Scarcella cases. About 6 of them involved Detective Scarcella. 6. Now that's important because there's a whole bunch of other folks that never met Detective Scarcella. So what I think that this board reflects is a systemic failure, not just by prosecutors, but by judges, by defense attorneys. Would you believe that in some of these cases, when these guys were on trial for murder, their defense attorney waived an opening statement? How is that? To me, that's muy loco. Your client's on trial for murder. I'm not going to do an opening statement. I think what happened is you have to look at these cases in the right context. You can't really look at them in 2016 without understanding what was happening back in the 80s and 90s. Many of us were here back then, and New York City was a totally different place, right? Our criminal justice system was overwhelmed with crime. Jurors who served on the juries, they were overwhelmed with crime. That doesn't excuse what prosecutors failed to do, but it was more than just a prosecutor-police relationship. I'll give you an example. The last guy we just exonerated, and that was the other day, Andre Hatchett. He was put on trial for murder. First of all, just before the murder, Mr. Hatchett was shot in Brooklyn. He was shot in his neck and he was shot in his leg. So he had a trachea, and he had a leg in a cast, and he had crutches. The victim, Miss Carter, who was murdered in a park in Bed-Stuy that he was charged with, was brutally beaten and dragged through that park. What was up with that? His lawyer never argued that he didn't even have the physical ability to do that crime. The judge presided over that trial, the prosecutor back then, and there was failures on our part as well. But just look at his condition. And he was convicted of Miss Carter's murder. And he was convicted based on the testimony of a sole witness, one witness, a guy who was in custody for burglary. He said, that guy right there committed the murder in the park. So we got the guy, now we know who did it. We looked into it. The guy who he fingered initially was in custody at the time. So we went back to him and said, it couldn't have been that guy. Because he's like, oh, no, it was this guy. Hatchet, that's the guy. We didn't even turn that over. We never turned over his first ID. We never turned that over. And the fact that he told us I was smoking crack the day of the murder. When he got on the stand, he was asked, did you ever smoke crack? I never smoked crack cocaine in my life. We didn't say, yes, you did. You told us you did. It was systemic failures. What I'm hoping is that the way, I think that before, there might have been sort of a desire when you were, this is what the folks who've been in the office for a long time tell me, that back in the day, they might have said, hey, you know, this is kind of shaky, but let the grand jury figure it out. Oh, the grand jury indicted? Okay. Just let the trial jury figure it out. Oh, they convicted him? I'm hoping that there's a different attitude now. I get to hire 50 prosecutors every year, and these young folks are coming from all over the country, and they want to live in Brooklyn. They act like they want to work for me. They don't want to work for me. They want to live in Brooklyn, right? And they say, oh, we love you. I'm like, yeah. I'm the only thing stopping them from moving to Brooklyn. But they tell me that this is the work that attracts them, many of them. And I ask them, what do you think is the main duty of a prosecutor? And many of them say to do justice. And I said, what does that mean to you? Because I think the days of just trying to convict or let the jury figure it out and what happens, happens. I hope that those days are over in New York City. But I have to say there are over 2,000 district attorney offices in the country. And there are no more than, I think, 20 conviction review units. And I have the largest in the nation. And I hope they'll look at what I'm doing in Brooklyn and see that it's okay, that people think that this is the right thing to do, because there's something in all of us that's about fairness. And so it's unfortunate that when people talk about the wrongful convictions in Brooklyn, they tag Detective Scarcella with all of this stuff. It wasn't just one cop. It wasn't just one prosecutor. It was systemic failures. And so I think that we have to develop a new generation of prosecutors that understand that they have to protect public safety and we have to convict people. But our sole goal can't just be convictions. We had a young lady from Yale Law School. She wanted to work for us. We said, why? I want to convict. I want to convict. We rejected her from Yale Law School because that's not what we want.
We have two more. One here.
Mr. District Attorney, your anecdote about the young woman in Brooklyn who lost her baby in the shooting in Red Hook brings to mind a somewhat similar or parallel situation. There have been links to permanent illness and death by hepatitis, infants who undergo particular circumcision rite. And there has been a discussion about how to control or how to identify the individuals who transmit hepatitis to infants in this circumstance. Is there a way in which the participants in that circumcision rite could be cleared for health reasons, and people who perform that rite who are ill and who transmit and permanent injury or death to the infants should be addressed? One major public official of this city said that to try to address that issue would drive the process underground and make it impossible to track. And since basically this is an issue in Kings County, I thought maybe you had devoted some thought to it.
Well, I want hard questions. Why you no, that is a very, we haven't zeroed in on that. I have read something about that with the mayor and all, but I'm not sure if we're in a position now to opine on that.
Okay, hi. Going back to what you had talked about previously, has your about Apple and the phones and going
Yes.
and trying to find out, has your office directly asked Apple or any smartphone company to open a phone? And the second part is that in light of the conviction review, essentially on one end, and the targeting the guns and the gangs on the other, has your office, your administration, made any changes in sentencing policy or plea bargain policies?
Well, with respect to the phones, I'm not aware of any any instance when we asked Google or Apple to help us with the phones. We have asked for the FBI to help us with the phone. With respect to plea policies, we are taking a stronger position than the previous administration with respect to guns. We have now a gun part, and we're the only place in the city that has it. It started in Brooklyn, where we're going to fast-track gun cases. You know, a lot of the young guys that I showed you, these pins, they get arrested for having a gun. They're out, and they're out for a year waiting for their case to go to trial, and that's just too much. And so now, we tried it before years ago, but it didn't quite work. Now we have 2 dedicated judges in Brooklyn State Supreme. I have a new gun part. I have a new chief in charge of it, and our goal is to get resolution of those cases right away, because we need to deal with those gun cases. These guys need to know that there are consequences. But also, for carrying a gun, let me also say this. If you think that the only way that we could solve the gun problem is just to arrest, indict, and convict, and incarcerate, that's not true. It's just not. We have to try to save some of these young folks. We have to. And so we have initiatives in the office as well that's designed to try to save the ones we can save. Because when they go to prison for only a few years. And these are not, we're not talking about 30-year-olds. We're talking about 17-year-olds. We're talking about young guys. And so they go to prison for 3 years. They come back 19, 20 with no education, no hope. They're going to be more of a terror in our communities. So we have a multifaceted approach, but it also involves trying to save some of these young guys with some alternative to incarceration programs. We're the only ones in the city that have it. I stand by those programs. And also, I just want to tell you, we do 100,000 cases a year. 100,000. That's what I said. I've been in for 2 years. I've done 200,000. You guys might have said, oh, he must have misspoke. 100,000 cases a year in Brooklyn. It is I have meetings with Commissioner Bratton. It is a very important law enforcement office in the country.
Well, I wish we could keep him longer. I promised I'd get him out the door for you. Some of you, I know, have questions, and I'm sorry I couldn't get to you all. It is important that we give D.A. Thompson our honorary membership in the Silurians, which we do. You are now a Silurian. We are delighted. Thank you, thank you. Thank you for being here. And before you run out the door, some of you may want to corral the DA. I don't know how hard he is at running, but we've got a couple of things that you need to know. Next month, Wednesday, April 20th, we have famed political biographer, winner of 2 Pulitzers, 3 National Book Critics Circle Awards, a man who knows politics, perhaps, as no other. He did the biographies of Robert Moses and Lyndon Johnson. Robert Caro is going to be here.
That's a great one.
April 20th. May 18th will be our annual awards dinner. That's going to be next door in the Players because the dining room there is larger and we have a huge crowd for that. You'll get information about that in the mail. Wednesday, June 15th, our final lunch of this season. We'll be right back here. We are going to have the delightful, engaging online journalism geek Sri Srinivasan, who is up at Columbia as an assistant dean, and he's now sharing all public information and beauty of the Metropolitan Museum of Art with the public. That's not a bad way to start this summer. So we're going to thank you all for coming. We will see you next month. Don't forget to put your name tags back there where Mary Jane is standing, back in the corner. Thank you all, and thank you, Mr. District Attorney.
Happy to tell you.